Hi, my name is Heidi Richardson.
And my name is Sophia Soto.
We did our senior project on the effects patient factors have on the success of in vitro fertilization.
The agenda for today is going to be as follows. We will be talking about the background of IVF because it is such a complex concept. We will be going over our problem statement as well as some literature review that we've done, some analysis, our results, and our cost analysis.
Before we begin our analysis, it's important for you to understand the in vitro fertilization process. It's a procedure in which eggs from a woman's ovaries are removed. They are fertilized with sperm in a laboratory procedure, and then the fertilized egg is returned to the woman's uterus. There are 4 main steps in this process. The first is where the ovulation induction begins, also known as a follicle stimulation step. This is where a fertility specialist will monitor ovaries and the timing of the egg release to ensure that hormone levels are normal. Most women take fertility medicine to produce more eggs during this step. The second is egg retrieval, where a very thin needle is passed through the upper vaginal wall to remove fluid from the follicles and retrieve the oocytes. The egg is then placed into a dish to transfer to the incubator. Step 3 is where sperm is mixed with the egg and monitored to make sure that a healthy embryo develops. In the final step of IVF, the embryos are first examined and graded to ensure that the healthiest ones are transferred. The day of transfer can vary between day 3 embryos and day 5 embryos. The biggest difference between these two is that day 3 embryos have about 4 to 8 cells, and day 5s, now called blastocysts, have 70 to 100 cells. Although it's been proven that day 5 embryos have a better implantation rate, the biggest reason for clinics transferring on day 3 is because they do not have technology to grow day 5 embryos.
In essence, the goal of this project is to find the effects that patient factors have on the success rate of IVF. Some of these patient factors are the age of the patients, their BMI, smoking, and the amount of FSH levels in their blood.
In order to ensure that we had enough knowledge on the subject, we did extensive research on studies already conducted regarding these patient factors such as age, BMI, smoking, and the level of FSH in their blood. Throughout our research, we learned that age plays a significant role in IVF success. BMI and smoking, however, had multiple studies where it showed that they were significant and some that showed that they weren't. FSH levels also play a significant role. Since we didn't find any articles on the difference in embryo quality across low and high-performing clinics, we decided to focus on this area of study as well.
The national data that we analyzed for this project came from the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technologies, also known as SART. The data was collected over 3 years with a total of over 36,800 patients and included a very detailed description of patients and embryo morphology. Embryo morphology encompasses all of the descriptions of an embryo, including how many cells they had, the day in which they were transferred, their symmetry, and fragmentation.
Because the human body and this process are so complex, it is impossible to ignore the effects that a patient has on embryo type or a clinic's method of growing embryos has on an embryo type. So we decided to focus on the patient factor aspect and design our analysis around blocking out the effects of the other 2 as much as possible. A master's student is currently writing his thesis encompassing the remaining 2 factors of embryo type and clinic percentile.
In order to have data that we could work with, it was necessary to make some adjustments to it. Since the data was collected by patient and each patient produces several embryos, it was necessary to break up the data by embryo morphology instead. We then filtered out all the cases that were not going to be useful in our analysis. The only cases that were useful were the ones where all embryos were successful or not. For example, if 2 embryos were transferred and 2 embryos implanted, then we knew that both of those were successful and therefore knew each embryo's characteristics. In cases where more embryos were transferred than implanted, it is impossible to determine which one of those embryos were the successful ones. We then followed by calculating the implantation rate of each embryo. which served as a basis for the rest of our analysis. And the formula for implantation rate was just the number of implantations divided by the number of embryos transferred.
The main goals we set for this research were to analyze what patient factors in our data played a significant role in IVF success. Those factors included the level of follicle-stimulating hormone in the patient's blood, their age, their body mass index, and whether they're a smoker or not. We also wanted to see if age was significant in embryo quality, as well as across percentiles and morphology.
Some of the tools that we used in order to come up with the conclusions that we did for this project were Dr. Steinleiner, who is an IVF doctor here in SLO. He owns his own clinic and also purchased all of the data that we have been using for the project. Dr. Pan, who is our statistics professor at Cal Poly. Both of their statistical and medical backgrounds were really helpful for us throughout this project. We also used JUMP as a statistical analysis tool, Access, and Microsoft Excel to analyze all of our data. The first analysis that we conducted was to see whether age, BMI, and smoking had any effect on implantation rate. Our groups were divided into patients below 35 years old, patients between 36 and 39 years old, and patients that were over 40 years old. As you can see from this graph, it is safe to say that we have constant variance. We then ran a nominal logistic model and concluded that there were no interactions between the factors and that only age is significant with the p-value less than 0.1. This means that our older patients have a lower implantation rate and vice versa, our younger patients have a higher implantation rate. This was helpful because for the rest of our project, we were going to have to deal with 2 less factors. This is a graphical representation of implantation rate by age, and it is clear that the older you get, your implantation rate severely drops.
After we conducted our analysis, we wanted to see how patients were distributed across clinic percentiles. These percentiles range from the 1st to the 90th, where the 90th percentile is the highest performing clinic. At the time, we broke up our groupings into body mass index and whether the patient was a smoker or not. But once we found that age was a significant factor, we wanted to see if any clinic had a skewed distribution of patient age. It is clear from this graph that higher performing clinics are not favored by better patients.
The next analysis we conducted was to see whether age affected FSH levels. This graph shows constant variance, and our one-way ANOVA shows that age is significant in determining FSH levels in our patients. We also have a connecting letters report showing that age groups do not overlap. So this means that the older you get, the higher your levels of FSH will be in your blood.
We created a regression plot to show if there was a correlation between the follicle-stimulating hormone level in the patient's blood and the number of oocytes that the patient produced. From our graph, you can see that as the FSH level decreases, the number of oocytes increases, or vice versa.
Our next step was to evaluate whether the number of oocytes retrieved from a patient could affect the implantation rate. The graph shows our one-way ANOVA and clearly states that it is significant. We can gather from the letters report that more eggs produced will yield a higher implantation rate.
Finally, we studied embryo morphology and implantation rates across percentiles. We grouped percentiles by categories, the first being 1st to the 30th percentiles, the second being 40 to the 60th, and the third being 70 to the 90th percentile clinics. This particular analysis shows day 5 type embryos under the category of an expanded blastocyst with a good inner cell and a good trophectoderm. The model is found to be significant, with higher performing clinics yielding more successful implantation rates. This makes sense, as higher performing clinics tend to have better technology that enables them to grow day 5 embryos, while most lower performing clinics lack the technology to support day 5 embryos.
This analysis is very similar to the one we just saw for day 5, except it is for day 3 embryos in the category of 8-cell, 0 fragmentation, and perfect symmetry embryos. Because all clinics are able to produce day 3 embryos, we found our model is significant, but it is not as clearly defined as day 5 across the clinics. In practice, this makes sense because the higher performing clinics will only transfer on day 3 if the embryo quality of the patient is really low.
In summary, we concluded that age is significant with regards to implantation rate and FSH level. The older the patient is, the higher the FSH level will be, making the implantation rate lower. For smoking and body mass index, we were unable to reject the null hypothesis and could not conclude any significance on their effect of implantation rate. FSH level played an important role in the number of oocytes retrieved, which in turn plays a large role in determining implantation success. Lastly, we found that embryo morphology was significant across percentile groups, especially within day 5. This means that the process used to grow embryos is very crucial.
For our cost of analysis, we considered both direct and indirect costs. For direct costs, we have considered the price and number of treatments an example patient might undergo. Any patient wants to spend the least amount of money possible to achieve pregnancy. Higher percentile clinics may charge more money up front, but have proven to have a better success rate. Even though lower percentile clinics do cost less up front, the patient will most likely need more than one treatment, leading to higher total cost. For clinics, having a higher implantation rate and success rate can allow them to charge more up front. Therefore, any improvements in the process will be very significant for both clinics and patients. For indirect costs, we decided to focus on these 3 main categories. For emotional, we wanted to figure out what emotional stress IVF can have on a patient. For women, the pregnancy process is an emotional one. Hoping for a positive result can be draining, a negative result, and very earth-shattering. The stress of a non-fulfilled wish for a child has been associated with emotional symptoms such as anger, depression, anxiety, and feeling of worthlessness. Patients have rated the stress of undergoing IVF as more stressful than or almost as stressful as any other major life event, such as the death of a family member or separation or divorce. The next indirect cost is physically. Women undergo many rigorous rounds of follicle-stimulating medications and injections. Patients undergoing IVF have been found to experience more stress and physical discomfort when compared to a normal menstrual cycle. For relationships, couples are looking to begin their family together, and not being able to do so puts a strain on the relationship. IVF processes are also very expensive and contribute to financial stresses.
Because of our time constraint, we were not able to focus on all of the areas we had wished. Our recommendations for future directions would be to take our analysis further and see how everything we researched affects live birth rate instead of only implantation rate. Our research will also serve as a baseline for future quality analytics in assisted reproductive technologies. Lastly, we would recommend to examine the different clinic procedures for each step of the IVF process and compare it across clinic percentiles.
We will both like to thank you for your time, and we will be looking forward to the questions you have.